Hey everyone, I'm Daniel,
And I'm Jun,
and this is
Korean.
American.
Hey Daniel,
Hey June.
for this episode, I'd like to talk about our lunch that we had with our friends yesterday.
Yeah, it was a great lunch. Our old work team hadn't seen each other for 3 months, so we
Yeah.
got together,
Mhm.
ate at a Korean American style K barbecue place.
Yeah, it was
It
amazing.
was good.
The theme was really on spot, right?
Yeah.
Which is very unique. It's like, yeah, there's a mind play here.
Yeah.
It's a Korean American themed K barbecue place in Korea, which is interesting.
I will say it felt more like a Korean barbecue place in Korea
Yeah.
than like I was transported to America.
Yeah. Surprisingly, we're not going to talk about food today. We're going to talk about. So it starts from why we had this lunch yesterday.
Yes. So we were gathered to celebrate many things, but one of them was our former coworker. Let's call them by their initial, Jay.
Jay.
They just graduated and got a new job at Samsung.
Samsung, yeah. And as our audience can imagine, getting into Samsung is a really big deal in Korea, especially because this person just graduated from college, right?
Yeah.
And I just did a quick research, and it turns out Samsung is the #1 desired company that college students want to work for
Wow.
this year.
Jay, again, congratulations. That's amazing.
Congratulations.
Also-
And- yeah.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Samsung is the biggest employer in Korea. Is that right?
I would think so.
Okay. That's always what I'd heard, but yeah, it's
The
okay.
reason that I'm hesitating is because it might be Coupang now because
Oh,
there's
wow.
so many people working at the fulfillment centers.
Mm,
But it might be Samsung. I might be wrong.
that's its own separate top.
Yeah.
Like, are the fulfillment workers full-time employees
Mhm.
or are they just kind of part-timers?
Yeah, so Coupang always try to advertise themselves as like the biggest employer in Korea or whatnot, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
Speaking of the ranking of the desired companies to work for, people might think that Samsung might be all-time #1, but it's actually not.
Mm,
As a matter of fact, I'm looking at articles right now. Samsung has came back to #1 in 7 years.
oh, wow.
For the past 7 years, I think there was a hype in the tech industry.
Yeah.
For a long time, it was either Kakao or Naver. I think.
Should we take a quick pause to go over the tech landscape in Korea? Like, what is the Google equivalent? What is Coupang? The Amazon equivalent? Is that worthwhile?
The Google equivalent of Korea definitely would be Naver and Kakao. Naver is this tech giant that's mainly based on search, like Google. And Kakao is a messenger service. You can think of it as WhatsApp
Yeah.
of Korea.
Yeah. There's not really any everything messaging apps in the US, but definitely WhatsApp is kind of the everything app, or, WeChat in China.
Yeah.
Very famously.
Interestingly enough, the WhatsApp of Japan, called Line, was also made by Naver. which
Yeah.
is a Korean
That is
company.
interesting.
That is very interesting.
I think you've mentioned there's like FANG is for Facebook, Amazon, Apple,
yes.
Netflix, Google. What's the Korean equivalent?
The Korean equivalent is NaKaLaCouBae, which is the first word of these 5 companies. Ne, obviously Naver, Kakao, Line, as in the messenger that we just talked about, Coupang, which is like the Amazon of Korea. Bae is 배달의 민족, which is like the DoorDash of Korea.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So these 5 companies.
Cool.
Sometimes they put in like 당to,
Yeah.
like these 2 startups.
What are those two?
Unicorn startups. Hangul Market. I don't know if there's an equivalent in the US, but it's it's Facebook Marketplace.
Oh, yeah.
Of Korea.
Or Craigslist historically,
Yes,
right? Just
yes.
like localized search and advertisement and classifieds.
Hyper local used items trading platform. To is for toss, sort of like what's like the Venmo.
Maybe Venmo or PayPal.
Yeah. Anyways.
I'm curious though, Samsung is not in that list of tech giants, right? When I think of tech in Korea,
yeah.
Samsung's the first company I think of.
Oh.
Why isn't it included?
Oh, I don't think Korean people consider Samsung as a tech company. We call it a manufacturing company. We call tech as IT for information technology, right? Samsung usually, they're not considered as tech company. It might be because I work for the tech company
Yeah.
and I'm more like carefully classifying them, but usually,
No, I just think historically, well, again, most people outside of Korea, when they hear Samsung, they think of, Samsung Android phones, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so from that perspective, it's competing with Apple directly. Apple's in the FANG, Apple's thought of as high tech. I agree in Korea, Samsung is not considered tech. I just found it interesting.
Oh, but so isn't there a slight difference even in the States between companies like Facebook and Google versus companies like Apple?
Sure, like pure software versus like appliances or hardware. Yeah, I'd say there's a small difference, but Apple's still included in kind of the high tech set of companies. Yeah.
Interesting.
Anyway, back on track. What are the other top companies to work for that new grads want to go to in Korea?
So I think there's a implication of why Samsung became number one again, and I think it reflects the current economic status and like the deflation of the tech hype that we're witnessing right now.
Yeah,
it influenced the ranking, but Kakao is still number two. Number three, surprisingly, is Samsung Biologics.
Oh,
yeah, which a lot of people think of is like the next thing for Samsung.
Yeah,
is the biotech.
Yeah,
so I think it's favored by college students. Number four, I don't know if a lot of listeners might know this company. They might. Amore Pacific. It's the biggest
cosmetics
company.
Yeah. K-Beauty.
K-Beauty. Number five, Naver.
Nice.
Yeah.
So tech is still strong, but the story here is Samsung's back on top.
Yeah, because large conglomerates like Samsung is traditionally known to be more stable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're preferring stability. Cool.
So our friend Jay went into the most desired company.
Yeah, that's huge. So yesterday at lunch, they were, Jay was telling us about the interview process and basically, what onboarding looks like.
Yeah.
So I'll give a quick summary and then Jun, maybe you could jump in and describe why it is this way.
Yes.
So Jay was telling us the interview process. First of all, there's some sort of SAT type test.
Specifically called SSAT.
So the Samsung SATs.
Yeah.
Is it actually called that?
Yes.
Okay.
Stop to.
Sangshia, the double shot.
Yeah.
So there's a Samsung SAT. After that, they did 3 rounds of interviews, each with 3 people. So it's 3 people interviewing 1 person. And so after that, at the end, apparently they got a higher offer. And they're starting in August as a big group. Basically, all the new grads or the new hires together are going to be at like a 2-week sleepover boot camp, after which they'll get assigned to a team or a role.
Yeah.
But actually during that 2 weeks, it's not just like a vacation or camp, just for fun. They're actually being evaluated, I believe. And they're getting scored on that time as well. So it sounds honestly a little bit stressful, although it also sounds pretty fun.
Yeah.
So that's what a Samsung interview and kind of new hiring onboarding process looks like.
Yeah, I think you're pretty on spot. And although I've never worked to start with, we have to mention that the way that Jay has been recruited is through a very unique process, unique to Korean employment types. And you called it batch recruitment, right?
Yeah.
In Korea, it's called 공채, short for 공개 채용, right? It's translated to public recruitment. So it's like a big announcement that traditionally these large conglomerate companies would make every year, saying, oh, all the new grads, right? We're open for this batch recruitment. And most of I would say 90%, more than 90% of the applicants would be new grads. And they go through this process and they all go through the camp that you mentioned. And I was surprised. I asked yesterday to Jay and they said it's 2 weeks long.
Yeah, that's pretty long.
I asked them if it was 1 week.
Yeah.
And I already thought 1 week was
long.
And they were like, no, it's 2 weeks.
Quick aside here. Everyone apparently comes out of this 2-week boot camp being a huge Samsung fan, drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
We call it being a homer or stan, just like they're in love with Samsung after this camp.
You know what they call it? They call it, I became blue-blooded.
Oh, blue-blooded.
Blue is for Samsung.
Yeah.
So curious to meet Jay after the 2 weeks.
Yeah. They'll be decked out in Samsung gear and talking the corporate talk. But yeah, I mean, batch recruiting to me sounds reasonable, especially when you said it's mostly new grads, because, people graduate together, right? Everyone graduates. I think in Korea, colleges have March to July semester, and then August is off, and then September to January, February is off. So, it makes sense that they would do recruiting together at that time. Is there anything more to this than just following the college schedule?
So I've never been employed through a 공채 process, but I was always jealous of these people who went through this process because they have like their allies, right?
Yeah.
They have a special bond of like, we call them 동기, as in like same class, right? Usually people experience this through college, right? Or school.
Yeah.
But you experience a similar thing in a company too, which I think was pretty neat, right? And it's also good for gathering company-wide information because all of your 동기s would be dispersed throughout the company and are working for different orgs, so you can know like the nitty-gritties of like what's going on in each org. It's also good networking if you want to transfer into a different org. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess we didn't ask how many new grads are in one class, but yeah, if it's like what do you think, like 200-300 people, or is it more like 500?
I would
More?
guess thousands.
Thousands? Okay. Yeah. Well, then it's going to be hard to get to know people, but it sounds fun. It sounds like freshman year college. You're coming on campus.
Yeah.
You're all in a dorm together. And like, you know, you're going to build some lifelong friendships there and go through something together.
Yeah, it's a lifetime experience, definitely.
Yeah. And, you know, also interestingly, I think most Koreans don't actually stay in dorms. They usually, or I don't know if most, but a lot of them just stay at home, right? So this is their first experience being outside of the home, let's say, and like living with other people for an extended period of time, right? I think deep bonds and maybe romantic relationships like can really form, right?
That's what I heard. A lot of CCs, so-called company couples.
Oh, yeah. CC also could stand for college campus couple. Is that campus couple?
Campus couple.
Okay. Yeah. You know, and you know, in Korea, we mentioned before, the specs really matter. So you're on equal specs. You both work for the same company.
Yeah, and especially if you're working for a company
like Samsung, which is elite, right? Yeah. And you also said, I think everyone starts with the same salary. So this really this level of equality in that group, right? Where everyone can really bond together. They're all on equal footing in almost every aspect, right? Yeah, that sounds really cool. I'm jealous.
Yeah, it sounds fun.
You were saying, though, I think another interesting thing here is these friendships and bonds can really last a lifetime. I think that's especially true in Korea. And I want to use this as a chance to transition into talking about employment law. In Korea, it's still common for a lot of people to just work for the same company their whole life, right?
It was for a long time.
Yeah.
It's becoming slightly different recently, not because employment laws has changed, but by the choice of the employees.
Yeah. But in Korea, employers, when you hire someone, it's generally considered for life. Like I'm committing to pay this person and have them work for me for the rest of their life if they choose to do so.
Exactly.
I think the biggest difference, my understanding in employment law is in the US, a lot of it is called at-will employment, which means either your employer or you can just choose to quit or they can fire you almost at any time. There doesn't have to be a super deep justification. They can just let you go. In Korea, this is definitely not the case. I think it's very hard to be fired. And unless you do something illegal or the company is going bankrupt, it's almost impossible for a company to fire someone.
Yeah. And when you say it's almost impossible, it is actually
it's actually
true.
Impossible. Yeah.
It's pretty much impossible to, even if the employee did something illegal, like in real life, a lot of the times it's difficult to prove it. And Korean employment law is very much in favor of the employee than the employer. So yeah, there's definitely a sense of lifetime employment in Korea.
I was talking to a friend, they happen to be French, about the difference between Korean employment law and US employment law. And to be fair, I think France is on the other end of the spectrum as well, like Korea, very employee favorable. But he reminded me that the way that Korea and France and a lot of other countries operate, that's the norm globally. And the US is one of the few countries in the world where it's so easy for an employer to just fire you. And it was just a good reminder again. It's like, I just assumed that was always the case for every country, right? It's like a capitalistic society. Of course, the employer can just fire you at any point, but it's not the case in most of the world.
I mean, employees definitely do benefit from the employment law, but there are, I guess, controversies or different opinions, even within Korean people, about, so we call it 고용 유연성, employment flexibility, because it's so inflexible in Korea that employment law protects the employees so strongly that it's really unfavorable of the employers which makes the employment market in general very inflexible.
Yeah. Again, we're not a political podcast.
Yeah.
But it's a big argument against, let's say, socialism,
Yeah.
right? It's inefficient, right? Whereas capitalist societies are highly efficient,
Yeah.
but kind of brutal, right? And in a
There's-
sense, it's not stable. Yeah,
There are goods and bads, definitely. Yeah.
for sure. How do you think this employment law situation, basically, when you hire someone, it's for life? Any thoughts on how this might impact, hiring process or how companies think about hiring, or even more broadly, just work culture in general in Korea?
I think again, 공채, the batch recruitment was the standard of how large conglomerates employ their workers, but I think it is working against them now because this is just my theory. Korea was always on an economic growth state, and so there were always a bunch of people to employ and the company was always growing. So it just made sense to hire a bunch of people all at the same time all together. But now that Korea's economic growth is slowing down, and with the incredible employment law, for companies, it's very difficult to batch recruit like they did before, right? So, for instance, Naver, they haven't done batch recruitment for a very long time now. I think they just did this year, but it was very abnormal that they did.
Interesting.
Yeah.
One thing that comes to mind for me too is because you're hiring someone, for life in a sense, you can't fire them. I think Korean companies maybe tend to hire more for raw talent and potential, right? Because, we're going to invest in you. You're going to get trained over time. And we want you to be maybe flexible to switch roles. And so they care more about that than necessarily what skills you bring to the table from day one. Whereas when I think about jobs in the US, it is 100% about what can you do for us? Like, what skills do you have?
Interesting.
How are you going to add value from day one? And, of course, companies will invest in your long-term growth, but they really hire for your skills. Like, they want to know what you're going to do for them and how you're going to help them maybe make money or be a more successful business. And it just feels like Samsung and maybe more Korean companies are more, okay, how smart is this person? How fast can they learn something new? How dedicated and loyal and hardworking are they, right? More than what skills they have. I don't know, does that resonate with you?
That's really interesting because it also ties back to the reason why Naver did the batch recruitment recently. And one might think, right, the tech industry is not doing very well, and a lot of US tech companies are actually laying off a lot of their employees. Why is Naver doing the batch recruitment? Interesting enough, it's related to what you just said. And it also relates to how the software engineering salaries are so inflated. So Naver, I think they're kind of smart in that sense, is that to recruit a lot of seasoned engineers.
It's too expensive.
It's too expensive.
Yeah.
So they just decided to do the new grad batch employment and just train them, which is cheaper for them.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Another thing that comes to mind is I think Korea really emphasizes years of experience and maybe age over, let's say, again, what skills or talent you have, like your ability. Like years of experience really is the number one thing people lead with, right?
I think your age is quite important in Korean work culture because, again, traditionally, most people were employed through 공채, meaning that they all get employed at the same time, at the same age.
Yeah.
So basically, your age is roughly just your work experience.
But do they get promoted together? Do they get raises together? Like over time, how do their salaries diverge, would you say?
Yeah, so now after you get in together with your friends, now it differentiates by person.
I see.
So how well you do at work, it influences how fast you promote and your salary and whatnot.
That sounds pretty similar to the US, I think.
But that's also very recent, I think. Most traditionally in Korean workplaces, you just promote by how many years you've been in the company, almost automatically. But it became very different recently. Yeah.
Another impact or consequence of this employment for life is the difference between, let's say, salaried employees and full-time employees. And this concept of, I think it's called alba. Right? Part-timer. And I think it's pretty common now before anyone becomes a full-timer, they have an alba trial, right? Like you're part-time for 3 to 6 months. And then after that, if things go well, then you'll convert into full-time? Or is that not true?
I think alba is a slightly different term.
Yeah.
Alba, of course, it does refer to a timely paid employee, but it's more for
Lower skill jobs.
yeah, I wanted to find the more politically correct term.
I think it's similar in the US, low skill. There's a similar conception in the US. If you're hourly, it's very low skill, right? It's the cafe workers, it's the retail workers, it's manual labor. Whereas if you're salaried, it's more high skilled and white collar. Yeah.
One of the most well-known alba jobs would be people who are working at the convenience store.
Oh yeah. I see. Got it. So what is this trial period then? I think this is common, right? Before you get a full-time role, you have some 3 to 6 month trial employment period before they actually convert you into a full-timer. And the US equivalent would be kind of being a contract worker with the goal of like converting into full-time after. But I don't think that's necessarily expected for most full-time jobs. Whereas my understanding and conception in Korea is a lot of full-time jobs will basically trial you for 6 months before converting you. Again, because the consequences of hiring someone is so high.
Yeah, there's a term for that. It's called 수습 기간. And even in your 수습 기간, which is like your trial period, which is normally 3 months, you're still a full-time employee, but you're not protected by
the employment law
law that you cannot be fired.
I see.
Because it's you make a contract, right?
Yeah.
Within the 3 months, we will evaluate you. And if you don't meet our bar, we can terminate you.
Got it.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of exception. Yeah.
So I think the interesting thing here is it's an exception for the earliest, for a new hire in Korea. That kind of employment situation, that's the norm. Everyone's basically employed that way in the US.
Yeah, everyone is in the system.
So everyone is under the stress of like, oh, I could be fired at any point, right? And it just gives you a sense of, anyway, the difference, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. I do have a question. If you can't be fired in Korea, what motivates people to, I don't know, work and, work hard or go above and beyond? My perception of Korea is that people work a lot, right? They're in the office 10, 12 hours a day. They're working nights and weekends pretty frequently. So what motivates them? And yeah.
So you being a low performer wouldn't actually lead you to being fired.
Yeah.
But if you perform well, you can get promoted.
I see.
Yeah. And go up the conglomerate ladder.
Yeah.
Get higher pay, gain more power, authority. Yeah.
I guess. Okay. But if I'm okay with, it seems like it's very easy to just coast or dare I say quiet quit.
Yeah.
Like if I'm doing the bare minimum, I'm happy with my compensation. I don't care about a higher title or climbing up the ladder. Can I just do basically the bare minimum for as long as I want and just like continue to be paid that amount?
You can technically, but I heard that it's not as easy as you think.
Okay.
Right? Especially in Korea where there are a lot of social pressure. So you really have to not care about what other people
think about you. I
to be
see.
that person.
Yeah.
Right? It's like what is that person doing?
Yeah.
Like he's been in this company for like 20 years. And
No promotion. No. Okay. Yeah. It's really a shame or a cultural thing.
Yeah.
I think in the US it's quite acceptable or even encouraged. Hey, why do more than the bare minimum, right? So yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, it's becoming more and more of a thing in Korea within the younger generation. But yeah, I would imagine that it's harder than you think.
Okay.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, this is one of the methods that Korean employers fire their employees, forcing them to just leave by themselves.
Oh yeah.
By not promoting them for a long time.
Oh, I see. Yeah. And then they'll be so ashamed. They're so frustrated that they'll leave on their own accord. Let's see, Jun. I wanted to talk about this whole idea of the Samsung SATs. Again, from the dramas I've watched. For example, if I want to work for the Korean government, there's different government tests that I can take to get into these jobs, right? Can you talk more about that? Because for me, I think it's interesting. Of course, you can study and you can, go to school to get a degree, and that's going to help you get in certain jobs. But personally, I much more highly value as an employer work experience, right? And so if I have someone who's been working for, let's say, education for 5 years versus studying to pass some test about education for 5 years, in my mind, that person who's been working 5 years is going to be much better at their job, much more effective, and a better employee than someone who's just studying. But in Korea, it seems there's such a focus on kind of book studying, right? Like you study to take a test to get into something. Yeah, can you talk more about that?
Again, I think it differs by the type of employment process that you took, right? There's two different types of employment. One is 공채 that we just talked about, where most of the time the new grads apply. And then there's 경력직, meaning, I guess, experienced job. I always apply jobs as a 경력직.
Yeah.
In which case you're just individually hired.
I see.
Person by person. And so you don't have your classmates or whatnot. That's why I was always jealous of these people who have these classmates.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there are two different types of employment. And to defend the process of taking tests to get into companies, I would say, how would they gain experience in the first place, right?
Yeah, I see.
If you have 0 years of experience, how do you get into these companies?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So really, okay, what you're saying is the idea is any job where you're starting off, you're going to have to test to get into it.
Yes.
Yeah. I'd say that's a similar gripe in the US. You know, if you need experience for a job and you don't have any, how do you get your foot in the door?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you were saying you could take a test for the government. There are, levels 9 through 1, 9 being the lowest entry level.
Oh, yeah. For government jobs.
For government jobs. Yeah. Whereas, you could study and really hard and maybe get into a level 5 job, which is higher than someone who got in at level 9, but it's hard to get promoted from 9 to 5, if that makes sense.
That's a very good question. And I actually didn't think about it. So for our listeners,
maybe describe the whole government system, pay scale, and how it works.
I might not be the expert at this, but
close enough.
Common understanding of a Korean person, government jobs there are levels in government jobs. It starts from level 9 all the way up to, I don't know, I would guess level 1 being the highest. And the entry level of getting a government job is level 9. And for all odd number levels up to level 5, there's an entrance test in which if you pass, you directly start from that level. So I actually personally have a friend who went through this process and luckily got in. But the level 5 government work test is the hardest, to the extent of people studying for like 3 to 5 years.
Wow.
And it's called 행정고시.
Yeah.
And if you enter as level 5, you're really big deal. It's a really high level in the government.
The U.S. government is similar. A lot of government employees are on what's called the GS pay scale. Starts at level 1 being the lowest, and I think 15 is the highest. And you just kind of get promoted up through that. I'm not informed enough to know whether you can maybe take a test or if there's a way to start at a higher GS level per se. But if there is, I would say it's more based on an interview and the skills you have rather than how you performed on some standard test, right? Yeah.
Technically, it is possible to get into level 9 and then promote
all the way up.
There must be a limit.
Yeah.
But let's say 5.
Yeah.
But I heard that it's a very, very rare case.
Yeah. Interesting. Cool. I mean, there's a couple more things we could talk about, or we could wrap it up. What do you think?
You want to talk about overtime?
Let's talk about overtime.
Yeah.
So one big difference I will say, earlier we mentioned the difference between hourly employees and salaried employees in the US. And so, I was salaried in the US, but when I moved to Korea, I all of a sudden had to keep a monthly timesheet and actually, see how much I worked. And I believe that's because if I worked more than I was supposed to, or maybe more than I was expected to, they would pay me overtime.
Yes.
So it was really weird for me to go from being, not weird, but mentally thinking about going from being a salaried employee where no one cares about how much, hours I'm working, I just get the job done, to now being kind of tracked at an hourly basis. Like, how many hours are you physically working rather than what work are you producing, if that makes sense.
But so employees keeping timesheets for how much hours that they work doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting paid by the hour. Your base pay is still calculated by the year. That's why it's called 연봉, like salary of the year. But employers are required to pay you more if you pay overtime. And there are two different types of pay structures in Korea. One is 포괄임금제, one is a 비포괄임금제. Meaning one is included payment structure versus unincluded payment structure. The includedness refers to the overtime. So if your company is under an included payment structure, this is tricky. It means that the employer, they sort of guesstimate how many hours you would be overtiming and then they just include it in your base salary.
Oh wow.
Which sounds sweet,
Yeah.
but it's actually not.
Yeah.
It's much better for the employee to get paid just the minimum amount as base salary and then paid hourly for every extra hour that they work.
Yeah.
So you might see Korean people asking, right? Is this company 포괄?
Yeah.
비포괄?
Yeah.
Meaning, they want to know the pay structure.
Yeah. I also think it's interesting because in one of those, right, where it's included in, there's almost an expectation of you working overtime, right?
Yeah.
And I think that feeds into my narrative of Korean employees and companies where everyone's just overworked. Again, they're unhappy. They can't leave until their boss leaves.
Yeah. There was, but because of this new employment law,
Yeah.
and because a lot of employers don't want to pay overtime,
Yeah.
sometimes they would go to the extent of shutting off their computers, which actually does happen a lot.
Yeah, I think I heard that's quite common.
Yeah.
At 5 p.m., literally, or 6, whatever,
Yeah.
your computer shuts off and you can't turn it back on.
Yeah. I also heard horror stories about company computers shutting off, but then
In the middle of work or something?
then employees would go home and then work on their personal computer.
No.
But anyways.
Well, I think that wraps it up for today. Thank you for listening. You can follow us at Korean American Podcast on Instagram. I did create a Twitter, by the way,
Oh, you did?
but I think the Twitter handle is...
Twitter is dying.
I know. Well, because we have an Instagram, we have that same on Threads.
Yeah, Thread.
But no, Twitter's username has a limit on length, so Korean American Podcast didn't fit.
It's too low.
I think I went with at CoreAmPod. But I know we'll figure that out for the next time.
All right.
See you.
Hope to see you next week.
Bye.
Bye. I feel like Audacity is
Very
really
powerful.
advanced.
Yeah.
Especially compared to how it looks.
It
Looks like it's from the 90s.
is probably from the 90s.
Okay. Anyways, let's go.